Because if my story can help one person get the help, the healing, the counseling that they need, and prevent them from burnout, self-harm, or even suicide, then I'm okay with that. I'm not okay with where I'm at or what I struggle with, but I'm okay if it helps somebody.
Nick, last time that we were hanging out, I think I was misidentified as a gay man in a restaurant with you and I and Elise and our friend Brian. And the waitress really thought we were a couple.
Clarify, not you and me, but you and Brian.
Yeah,
Okay.
That's right. Not you and I. You had a beautiful young lady on your arm, and I had a bald man with me. And I don't know what kind of vibe I give off, and but I was happy to play along, and I made that woman's night.
We go back there and we look for that waitress. We haven't seen her yet.
It was a hilarious experience, dude. So didn't bother me a bit. If I can make somebody's day, and that was terrific. But
I think her day was made that evening.
Did we get free dessert or anything out of that? I don't remember.
We got a lot of comments is what we got.
Well, Nick, I just said that, we've had some time face to face, not near enough time, and which is, regrettable on my part. And I look forward to doing that, but I'm really glad you're taking the time to, hang out with me today. I want people to know about who you are, dude, because you've got an incredible story. It's a story that people need to hear. And I'm gonna push you hard to tell it today. And I know that you're willing to and you want to, but before we, start jumping into that lane, just let my listeners know on the Authentic Pastor podcast who Nick Mance is a little bit.
Yeah. So been in ministry for, student ministry specifically for almost 2 decades now. Served in a variety of capacities in student min, as well as other ministry positions. Actually, my first paid position was as a senior pastor. And after 2 years of that, realized, student ministry was a little bit more fun.
I did not know that. I did not know that you started out in senior pastor ministry.
Yeah, I did the whole part-time senior pastor thing, which is not real. It's always full-time. You just get paid part-time for it.
Of course.
But yeah, started out doing that in a small little town in New Jersey. Elise and I ended up getting married in 2013. So this year we'll be celebrating 10 years together.
Cool.
We've served in different parts of the country. We served in Iowa. Now we're in Hershey, Pennsylvania, serving student ministry out here. And we started out
Hershey, Pennsylvania being like the home of chocolate.
Yeah, ironically enough, we have Hershey chocolate just down the street, and then about 5 miles away from that, we also have Mars as a headquarters. So we have Mars and Hershey chocolate within 20 minutes of each other. And so
really?
Oh yeah. And apparently Mars is the place to go for Halloween. If you go to their factory, they just hand out the king size bars. Hershey really doesn't. So
well, I know where I'm spending Halloween.
Dude, you're welcome. You're welcome anytime. You know that.
So when you drive down the streets of Hershey, Pennsylvania, your lampposts look like Hershey Kisses, right?
They do.
I remember that.
And they also pump fake chocolate smell into the air.
In town?
Yeah. Actually, if you drive by the Reese's plant, you can actually smell the peanuts that they're roasting, and that's real. But in the actual downtown area.
I watched a really good, I don't know, it was History Channel or what it was, on the Men Who Made America, something like that, and saw that whole conflict that launched Reese into his own industry after working for Hershey, and that was
it's fascinating.
Absolutely, it was fascinating. When you start thinking about the money and the rivalry and everything that comes with that. I mean, we're talking about $1 billion industry. I was thinking when you talked about Hershey chocolate smell being piped into the town, that'd be a great, church growth strategy. I'd probably go to that church.
Well, you say that, but ironically enough, one of the things that we do for our student ministry is we bake chocolate chip cookies and we sell them
Yeah.
at our cafe for students each week. But we have found that the smell of chocolate chip cookies is so warm and inviting, it just pulls people in when they come to the church. So
Yeah.
I think there's a real market for, well, I mean, I think it's when you go back like thousands of years into Christendom, you see like how like even the Orthodox faith, like they use all the senses because like that's truly how we worship. And I don't know
Yeah.
if it has to necessarily be incense, if it can be chocolate, cookies, who knows? So
Well, chocolate smells better than incense in some of the churches I've been to
that is a fair statement.
that burn it. But well, what's interesting is that a few years ago I was on a fishing trip in Canada. Come to find out that the man I was fishing with, there's a number of us in ministry who were on this trip catching like monster northern pike, and was actually your senior pastor now.
Yep, George. Yeah, he's a good guy.
He's still probably recovering from being exposed to me, and I do that to people.
Maybe that's why he's taking sabbatical this year.
Is he right now?
He will actually take it this summer. He's taking over this summer. Although he does leave for Israel on Wednesday for a tour. So
all right,
yeah.
Well, good for George. We all need a break. You know that, I think, more than anybody, right?
Yeah.
So, like I said, I want to take us deep into really a kind of a dark topic. I think it's a dark topic. It doesn't have to be a dark topic if we would deal with it, but I know that you have struggled and battled mental health, and I know you're not ashamed to say that. And but I also want to talk about when you got to the point where you weren't afraid to say that, and you've had a battle with depression.
Yeah.
And so let me start with a question that I've been kicking around in my mind that might be a good place for us to launch this conversation. And then you can take it any direction you want. Like I told you, you've got complete control in this podcast. This is your life. When we talk about authenticity, you get to decide how vulnerable you really want to be.
Yeah.
But there are pastors listening. Some of the pastors listening secretly know that they are dealing with mental health. Others are dealing with mental health but don't know what it is. They're blaming it on something else. They beat themselves up spiritually, or they think there's something wrong with them. And other pastors listening, they flat out ignore it, which I'm afraid most of the church does. But so depending on who's listening, what would you want pastors to know? We can start in general about mental health, and then maybe mental health related to ministry, mental health in the life of a pastor like Nick Mance.
Yeah, that's wow. It's a good starting
How's
point.
That for like there you go. We just
Jumping
unloaded
right
the truck, man. We
Oh,
unloaded the
man.
truck.
Yeah, I think one of the first things I want people to understand about mental health is it's real. I think in spaces outside of ministry, that's just common knowledge that mental health is a very real issue. But for some reason within ministry, church spaces, sometimes mental health becomes like minimized, or people look at it and go, oh, it's just a spiritual battle, right? Like you're not praying enough, like your faith isn't strong enough. And it's like, no. Like those could definitely be components of it, but that doesn't minimize the reality that mental health is a very real thing. And I would just tell, I would tell your listeners who are in ministry, like if you think that you're wrestling with it, please just talk to somebody first. Like even if you're not sure, like part of my story is like I counseled people who struggle with this, like working with students. Like I counseled students with mental health and who were just struggling with all different things, from panic attacks, from suicidology, from depression, anxiety, self-harm, you name it, right? And walked with them. I knew the signs, I knew the symptoms, But oftentimes in ministry, because we're outpouring so much and caring so much, we don't see the signs in our own lives. And if you think
Can we
that
go
you're,
back?
yeah,
Can we go back to the word suicidology?
mm-hmm.
You just threw something at me that's a term that I'm not familiar with, and I think I'm pretty well versed in mental health.
And I might have misspoken when I said suicidology. Um, it's
Well,
the
if it's not a word, maybe it should be.
maybe, yeah, but the idealization of suicide, like just the fascination with it, like it's you're always focused on it, you're always thinking about it. It might not be that you are actively engaging towards it, but you've had thoughts about suicide or suicide idealization. Like you're just hyper focused on it.
Would you say that fascination, focus in your couple decades of ministry, are you seeing the increase in specifically with the next gen?
Oh, 100%. Yeah.
Yeah.
In talking with actual mental health professionals, they have said that we are past epidemic proportions when it comes to mental health.
Yeah,
And
yeah. Statistics just show that to be absolutely right. We
oh
can't,
yeah,
you can't question, you can't doubt it.
yep,
And at the same time, I feel like we still only give lip service
100%.
to it. What's the stigma? I mean, talk about multiple faceted answer, but what's the stigma and why do you think, before we start talking about more about your
Mm,
symptoms and your signs and your struggle, why are we so afraid?
mm,
What are we afraid of? Why do we dismiss it? Why do we spiritualize it instead of recognizing it as a health disorder, a disease,
mm.
even?
Well, I'll speak first in broad sense and then maybe more like ministry focused. I think broad sense in Christendom, I think not knowing something or not being aware of it, like fear of the unknown, is a very real thing. Um, and I think sometimes when we have a fear of the unknown, we are quick to dismiss it or put the solution on something that isn't really the solution. Um, and I think sometimes fear drives a lot of that. I think from a ministry focused perspective, though, for some reason, I think as pastors, we've gotten in our minds that like we have to present a certain way, like we have to pretend that we
Sure.
have it all together, right? That we're the ones who God has called, that God has placed in that position, and we have to care for our people, and we almost get like that Messiah complex going on, right? Of like we have to perform or appear a certain way, and I think whether a pastor wants to admit it or not, there's always some sort of like performance that we are attempting to present in what we do. Like we want to appear a certain way, we want to present a certain way, we want to be received a certain way. And I think if pastors are honest with themselves, like if we're not received a certain way or perceived a certain way, it can be devastating. Um,
Yeah, I mean, there's no question that we are paid to produce.
mhm,
Okay, um, and that's one of the difficult things about this authentic pastor
mhm,
project. You know, I was talking to a friend. Um, it's going to be on the podcast here in a couple weeks. That when you try to get people to be authentic and talk about the real struggles of life, and then exacerbate those with the role of a pastor, which
mhm,
adds other layers and unique qualities. You're really trying to get someone to publicly stand up and admit they have hemorrhoids, right? And then
yeah.
you're trying to sell them hemorrhoid cream
Mhm,
to relieve their itch
yeah.
and get rid of the discomfort. So you're trying to sell preparation to H to people who won't admit that they
Yep.
have a problem, which I think is the same as, say, the same. I'll be careful with that. I want to just synchronize these, but whether it be authenticity, mental health, all of that flies in the face of the role of a pastor to perform and produce. And it's not because we're necessarily disingenuous, but that's what people want.
Yeah.
And it's not healthy.
No, not at all.
It's not healthy for the body of Christ at all. And it's certainly not healthy for the leadership of the body of Christ. No wonder we're dealing with burnout and depression and anxiety and suicide, which those numbers, I mean, we talked about next gen, but those numbers are just growing crazy out of control.
Yeah.
And for people, because they don't know where to turn.
Yeah.
When did you start to recognize, or at least be able to identify, that this is repeated behavior, repeated thought cycle, the battle that goes on in your mind? At what point did you know, Nick, that something is not right?
Yeah.
What did that look like? How long did that take?
Too long. If I'm being perfectly honest, it took way too long. Yeah. Like I've had a counselor for a while, but I hadn't been meeting with him consistently. And ironically enough, it was you referenced Brian when we first kicked off the podcast, and Brian and I have a great history. Brian is a good friend of mine, a mentor in my life, and the reason I'm at Hershey Free, he's the guy who placed me here. And over a year ago, I was in a cohort with Brian and other youth workers around the country, and yeah, I will never forget. We were in a group discussion on Zoom, just talking through different things, and he and I had a one-on-one the next day, and he said, "Look," he goes, in these one-on-ones, we usually have an agenda of what we're walking through, usually based off our group conversation. He goes, "But man," he goes, "I care about you too much not to ask." He goes, "What's going on?" And I remember looking at him going, "Dude, I'm fine. Nothing's going on." I was like, "Just been a stressful week." And he just called me out, as only Brian can, in just his...
Never experienced it, dude. I have no idea what you're talking
You've never
about.
experienced Brian's honesty, bluntness, rawness. The attributes that just make Brian really good at what he does as a coach and job specialist. He looked at me, he goes, "Dude," he goes, "I have 2 degrees in counseling." And he goes, "You're struggling with depression and anxiety." I was like, "No way. No, like that's not me. I counsel people with that." Like I was pursuing a degree in counseling for a long time. I was like, "That's not me." And he goes, "No, I'm just telling you." And he began to unpack some of that stuff with me. And the more I realized it, the more I was like, whoa, like something's not clicking, something's wrong. And I remember talking with Elise, and that the next night I went to youth group, and actually I saw my counselor walking the hallways that day. And I just remember saying, "Hey man, like, can we talk real quick?" I was like, I should probably set up a session with you, and began to unpack some of it. And I will never forget the question he asked me. After I shared a lot of what was going on, he just looked at me. He goes, "Are you suicidal?" Like I've never been asked that question before, and it stopped me cold. And I wasn't, like, at that point I was not. I told him I didn't have that idealization. I hadn't thought about that. And it wrecked me. I mean, that night at youth group, I was worthless. Trying to go and teach and to present. And remember coming home and talking with Elise, and we went and we met with, started meeting with different people. And it, like, honestly, I think Elise even said it was like over the course of a week that all this just manifested and came out, and it was just so fast.
So the question, first Brian's conversation, then the question from your counselor became a real catalytic moment.
Yeah.
Where someone held up a mirror and made you take a deeper look.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the kind of love and care that really is empathy, right? That's really true.
Yeah.
Compassion. And I see you and hear in your voice reliving that pain, which means, there's a residual, there's a remnant that is there. Is that bit of remnant helpful, hurtful?
Um, no, I would say yes to both. But I would clarify when I say hurtful, I don't mean like a negative way. Um, it's hurtful because I never thought that I would be there. Um,
Mm-hmm.
I guess I convinced myself that, I counsel people with mental health struggles, but I would never have it. Um, even 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 with some of the trauma in my history, I just convinced myself that I was okay, that I'd moved through a lot of stuff, even when trying to carry the weight and to be the empathetic, sympathetic pastor. I convinced myself that I could carry those burdens and be okay with it. Um, and so it does. It brings up some hurt that I got to that place, but hurt again. Not that's a bad thing, but hurt that encourages me to keep fighting, um,
Mm-hmm.
to not get back
Well,
to that place.
you said earlier that too long. Your answer was, how
Mhm.
long did you deal with that? And you said
Yeah.
too long. I'm going to assume that for some people, too long meant they come to a devastating decision
Hmm.
and they acted in a way that, pastors who take their life,
Yeah.
right? That makes headlines. But you don't have to physically take your life to be dying
Yeah.
or dead inside. It's no different, I think, than you go, no way, man. I counsel that. The last 4 or 5 days, I've been on the phone with a pastor. Matter of fact, just before this podcast, I literally hung up about 10 minutes before this podcast with this individual whose marriage is about to implode.
Hmm.
And that was his same thought. It was like, dude, I've done this for 30 years, man. I, how did I trip into this? Um, well, because you weren't honest with yourself. You were
Yeah.
performing. You were producing, and you're human. You know, pastors are people too.
Yeah.
I just I just know so many pastors, and not to be indicting of my colleagues, that they do have that Messiah complex, not even intentionally. That feel like the savior of the whole thing because people applaud you and they call you pastor, right? You've got this place of position of elevation, and which I don't think is good for our ego, our
Hmm.
spiritual maturity. And I know people love to be called pastor, and some don't. Like, I refuse to be called pastor. People will say on Sunday morning, "Hey, this is Pastor Tim." I'm like, "You haven't been going here very long, have you?" I'm Tim. I happen to be lead pastor of this church, but hey, we'll just stick with Tim because I don't want to get puffed up because I think then that blurs the reality that you know I got stuff, man.
Yeah.
I'm not so spiritual. Matter of fact, I'm not very spiritual at all. But and people listen to the podcast and probably recognize that. But um, I don't want to get so full of myself that I can't see myself
Yeah.
clearly. So somebody did that for you, a
Hmm.
couple people. How did Elise respond to it?
Oh man. Um, yeah, I'll go back to how I'd answered before when I said it was too long. I guess about 6 months prior to Brian calling me out, I had what I didn't realize was a massive panic attack in front of Elise over
Hmm.
something stupid. I was trying to upload our fall plans for our student ministry program to social media and everything, and it didn't work. I thought it didn't work, and I started to get texts and emails from people just going, "Hey, something's not working," and I couldn't put my finger on it at the time what it was, but it was a massive panic attack, and
How'd that feel? Tell me about the people are listening,
Yeah.
Nick, who don't know what a panic attack feels like. They couldn't define it. So, and they're all the same. I know that,
Yeah.
but there are some characteristics of a panic attack. So, can you just unpack how that manifested in your emotions in your body?
Um, yeah, for me, I get an overwhelming sense of failure.
Okay.
I just, and like you said, it can look different for each person, like the emotions that you feel, but there are certain things. It's like your mind starts running at 100 miles per hour or more.
Yeah, you're racing. Yeah.
My pulse was quickening. Um, Elise would tell you I'm a pacer by nature. Usually when I'm on the phone, I just walk. That's just who I am. Uh, Emotions like just all over the map, going from extreme like just frustration, even anger, to just feeling depleted and just wanting to just break down and cry. Again, like that feeling of failure, like everybody's watching, everybody knows. The anxiety, just like the just the weight, the pressure that it feels like's on you, it's just overwhelming.
Yeah.
um Fear is a big part of panic attacks. And
I was years ago in the midst of some really heavy ministry issues, financial burden that comes with ministry issues, the stress of it all. I found myself having panic attacks like that to the point that one night, and I would do the same thing. I would pace and pace and pace and pace and just work myself into a lather, could not stop my mind, ended up on the bed in the fetal position.
mm,
And there's no way. And I'm supposed to get on a plane
yeah,
in the morning. And I told Cindy that I can't do it. I'm not going, and I don't think we recognized it as anxiety or panic at the time, but she had to actually call a friend to come over because she did not know what to do. She had never seen this level of emotional distraught.
yeah.
And it's not in one direction, right? It's not anger or sadness or pain, or it's everything.
It's everything all
It's
at
just
once.
one, it's a mess of a
Yep.
mix all at once.
Yeah, and it was the same for Elise. Like she didn't know what to do, and rightly so. I mean, in the big scheme of things, it wasn't a big deal. Um, but she immediately texted my brother and my sister-in-law, two people that we are very close to, and was like, I don't know what to do for Nick. And she was worried that she'd actually have to take me to like urgent care or something.
Mm-hmm.
And at that point, like even after the fact, and like, she just asked them to pray, and my brother and my sister-in-law sent like a care package the next week and everything. And after this had all happened, I again, not recognizing what it was at that point, I dismissed it. Um, and tried to explain away how I was feeling. And that's the one thing I've noticed with panic attacks is oftentimes like in the midst of them and even in the immediate aftermath, it's really difficult to put your finger on what's going on internally. It's really hard to explain why it felt that way. And oftentimes what I've realized in my journey is like you feel a certain way because things have been building over time. And part of the reason we can't put our finger on what that is because it's been so much in our history that has gotten us to that point that to simply narrow it down to like one moment,
Yeah.
circumstance, trigger, you can't, right?
So multifaceted.
Yeah.
Right?
And so yeah, that was about 6 to 8 months before Brian called me out. And I remember that week after talking with Brian and my counselor, things just started moving, man, like really, really fast. Um, we got my two direct supervisors involved. We got our senior administrator at the church involved. And I remember some of the conversations with Elise, and it was just like, man, this is going fast. Like, and not in a negative way. Like, I am abundantly thankful for the church I'm at right now because like they really stepped in and cared for me well. it was hard for me to see at the time, and I didn't like what they did. But they really stepped in and took some extreme measures to make sure that I was getting healthy. And I remember, again, for some reason, like some of the heavy conversations with my wife happened on youth group nights. But we were eating dinner right before I was getting ready to leave, and I remember sitting there and telling her, going, "Hey, somebody at church today who I was talking to about this said that there's a real possibility I might need to go on medication." And that made it real. I think for both Elise and I, because again, in working with people and helping them with mental health, you see the realities that like medication isn't a quick fix, and oftentimes, like especially with young people, as their brains are still developing, like you have to play around with, and play around is a loose term, and any medical professional would probably smack me for saying that. But you have to find the right dosage, and that can often cause additional difficulties in people's lives. And I remember Elise looking at me and going like, "I don't want you to change." And man, that again, like that was a really hard conversation. And then of course I had to go lead a youth ministry after that.
I think drugs are really good for youth ministry. Fair. I really do. I think all youth pastors should be medicated just because of 7th graders. So,
well, we have 6th graders too in our program, so even more fun.
Oh yeah, you need double meds. So you and I've had private conversations, and so a topic that I've not talked about on this podcast is not my mental health, but my physical health requires me to take bipolar medication.
Yeah.
And I'm always embarrassed. Cindy always laughs. Like I was in a doctor just a couple weeks ago. We got in a car accident a few weeks ago, and I'm not recovered from it. A few weeks ago, it's been 3.5 months. I just had a doctor's appointment this morning at 8:30. And I said, it's been 3.5 months. And every time we go to a doctor, and she goes in with me, so we get 2 sets of ears, hearing diagnosis and prognosis. They ask her if you're on medication. I hate to tell them what I'm on because think about stigma, right?
Yeah.
Even though I deal with this stuff all the time and have conversations with, people like you, when you tell somebody that you're on 1,200 milligrams of the most potent bipolar medication there is, even though it's been so good for me, but getting to the point where it was good for me, like we started on one med at 100 mils, and that got to the point where I just sat and cry all day long. And I told Cindy, if I have to swallow one more of these pills, I'll eat a bullet. Right? You know what that feels like. And then you go down, you titrate down off that, you titrate up to another one. Then you finally, after about 6 months, level out. But, for 2 years now, I have not felt like me.
Yeah.
And so I can manage, for me, it's for pain. My medication shuts down nerves in my brain, and but it rewires you. Yeah. New electricity, new chemistry, and so now that you're not dealing with I'm turning left for you, so you're dealing with some healthy results of medication. You're not 100% Nick Mance. Well, is that how you felt ever?
And I should clarify. I actually. My counselor and church staff had recommended that I might have to. I have not actually gone on any of that.
Oh, good for you, man. But can I pause there? Can
please.
I pause there? Because I think it's important to say to somebody listening, there's nothing wrong with going on medication.
No, not at all.
Because a lot of people think there's something. We'll talk about this in a second about like spiritually, something wrong with you spiritually. Why don't you just pray it away?
Yeah.
There's people who adamantly preach about like not doing meds because you just need to trust Jesus more, which you and I both know is just it's nonsense. It's not
foolish.
Biblical.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, and I would say to anyone who's listening, like I would encourage not self-medicating. That's never healthy. Like
don't roll one up on the street that you found,
yeah,
or
don't try
whatever,
to,
or find some pills from
yeah,
somebody's medicine cabinet.
don't try to mask with alcohol or food or whatever it
Right.
may be. Don't
All
try
kinds
to
of
sell.
medication.
Yeah.
Right.
But
Right.
like if you're meeting with a licensed clinical counselor or mental health professional and they recommend it, like that doesn't make you weaker. It doesn't make you anything less. It doesn't mean that you're not called to ministry. It doesn't disenfranchise you from what you're currently doing in ministry. It just means that like you are seeking to get holistically healthy, and in some ways, medication is good for that. I mean, like realistically, like I found as I've gotten older, like I have to take a daily vitamin, a probiotic, I have to take allergy meds, like all these different things. And
Mm-hmm.
there's nothing wrong with that. But unfortunately, there's that stigma that you referenced, right? When it comes to mental health. And that is the
Right.
biggest load of BS that we could feed to people, that taking medication is a problem. It's like, no, that's actually a good thing. And it could actually really, really help and be beneficial to you. So please don't ever feel like that's a bad thing.
So, which brings another question to my mind, because your story is so multi-layered. I love it. Thank you for sharing.
Sure.
But so how do you respond to people? And maybe you've not encountered this. I'm going to assume you have, but I could be wrong. How do you respond to people who say that pastors in particular who struggle with mental health should step down from their role?
Yeah, I think that goes back to whatever perception that people have about pastors, is that we're like this we're held to like this higher elevation, right? We're held to this image. It's the biggest load of BS out there. It's like we're just as broken and imperfect as the next person sitting next to us in the pews, if not more so.
Mm-hmm.
And I haven't necessarily had people tell me that because I struggle with it, I should step down, at least not to my face. There have been
Yeah,
murmurings
but
of
you are in
that.
a very atypical situation. We'll talk about your church
Yeah.
and your leadership as we approach the end of our conversation. But yeah, you've been blessed not to have that. I mean, it could be behind the scenes you're not aware of, but
Yeah.
I don't think so from everything you've told me.
I mean, I've definitely had people who've asked me, why didn't I just pray harder, right? Or, you took a leave of absence. Are you all better now? Is your mental health gone? And I'm like, what kind of a question is that? Like, that mental health is just something that you dismiss away, and we never. But I mean, there's definitely, perhaps the way I would term it, there's definitely an ignorance in how people understand it within the church, and I think people can say things from ignorance, from a place of not understanding.
Yeah.
Um, and I don't think it's necessarily meant to be derogatory or critical.
No, no,
It's a
I
lack
don't
of
think
understanding.
ignorance. Correct. I don't think ignorance has to be a derogatory word. There's a lot of things in life I'm certain that I am ignorant about, but I'm at least willing to embrace or learn or investigate, right?
Yeah. And that's the thing. And I know that there are pastors out there who, if they have been willing enough to be that vulnerable and to say, I struggle with it, that they've had people who've said, maybe you shouldn't be in ministry anymore. Pastors shouldn't struggle with that, or maybe you should step down. And my encouragement to them would be like, please know that's not everybody. Um,
Mm-hmm.
by and large, I think the more honest we are with our congregations about the struggles we have within reason, the I think the greater benefit we will see reaped within our congregations.
Well, that's the issue of authenticity, where it builds a bridge.
Yeah.
How many people sitting in the seats on a Sunday or weekend in every congregation are also dealing with it privately?
Yeah. And
Right?
that has been one of the biggest things, that has come out of this for me. Like I remember, sitting with my senior leadership team before I'm getting ready to leave, and our senior admin looked at me and just goes, "Hey Nick, like God's going to use this in powerful ways, and you may not see it, but He's going to use this in powerful ways in your life and in the life of our church." And I looked at her, and I will never forget. I looked at her and go, "I don't want to be that guy." I was like, I don't want to be that person. I never wanted
I
this.
don't want to be that testimony.
Yeah, I'm like, I don't. If I could rewind time, I would ask God to take this away from me.
Mm-hmm.
And I will never forget when they announced it to our church. Um, I was sitting in a pew when my senior pastor announced it, and that sucked. Um,
So what's the emotion? Embarrassment, humiliation,
oh
all the
yeah,
above.
I mean all the
What
above,
else?
like fear,
Yeah.
um,
Fear's a good one, right?
sadness that I
Yeah.
got into that place, like
Yeah.
failure was a big one. Like again, like pastors don't struggle with this, right? The lie that I was believing. Um, and I remember after that service, people just came up and hugged me. Um, people didn't, most people didn't know what to say. Um, and I just remember like after that, I ended up taking a 3 month leave of absence from the church.
Mm-hmm.
And
Now, if I'm correct, you were able, I hope I'm correct, you were able to take a paid 3 month leave of
correct,
absence.
yes, yeah, which was from talking with other people, other pastors specifically who struggle with this. That is not the norm. Um,
No, I wouldn't think so.
my my leadership team at the church, and my senior pastor George, he would say this often. We are not a perfect church, not at all. We all have our own struggles individually as a church, but man, like I am incredibly blessed to be at the church on that.
Mm-hmm. You are.
They walked with me. They admitted missteps in as much as I admitted missteps on my own. Um, they paid me throughout. They even allowed me to still participate in my cohort, which included traveling for our final one to Florida, and people rallied around us. People dropped off meals. People took my wife and I out. They respected our space. Um, they paid they paid for me to get counseling. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, like
Do
they
you know
stepped
how
up.
many pastors, more than you can imagine, listening right now, are envious,
Yeah,
just envious, because they're still to the point where they're barely admitting their own struggle, let alone confessing it, let alone believing because of fear that there's going to be any level of empathy. I actually believe that most churches, I don't make up a fictitious number here, 90% would really 100% embrace
yeah,
the honesty and come alongside a pastor. But we're so afraid. When the truth is, if you have a church that would not embrace and not support you, you're better off unemployed than you are to stay there, because it's going
very
to
much.
cost you your life
Yeah, and
at some
perhaps
point.
marriage, relationships, you name it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
All the above.
that was something that as I took time away, ironically enough, Easter this year was almost was close to a year from my break. But our church does something called the Easter experience. It's an immersive walkthrough experience of different aspects of the gospel. And my wife, being the creative person that she is, participates in that each year. And um, last year she was helping. She came home. She goes, "Hey," she goes, "I just want you to know I was talking with somebody who was helping there, and they were just so thankful that one of our pastors would be willing to be that vulnerable about their journey, because it gives people permission to be honest with theirs." And I remember looking at her going, "I wasn't honest. I didn't even tell people. Like I hid it. It was like our senior pastor announced it because I didn't have the courage, the balls to do it myself, right?" And she goes, "Yes, but you being willing to take time to get healthy is really good." And as I've stepped back in the ministry, I stepped back in at the end of May on an interim basis last year through the end of summer on kind of like part time to 3/4 time, and in September went back to full time. Um, the amount of people who've just said, "You've given us permission to be honest with ourselves, to get help."
Yeah. See,
That
that's what I love about your story, because authenticity, regardless if it's mental health or any
whatever.
daily battle, whatever it is contagious.
Yeah, and again, like, and I stick by my statement. that I told my senior admin of like, I don't want to be that guy. I don't, not because I don't want to admit to my own struggles, but I don't want to necessarily be the example. But what I would say is I would edit that statement to say that if my struggle, though, as much as I don't want to be the guy struggling with it, or the pastor who has the mental health struggles, if my authenticity, if my transparency can help one person, then I better freaking be that person.
Yeah.
Because if my story can help one person get the help, the healing, the counseling that they need, and prevent them from burnout, self-harm, or even suicide, then I'm okay with that. I'm not okay with where I'm at or what I struggle with, but I'm okay if it helps somebody.
Well, that goes back to a statement you said earlier, where people ask, like, "Are you better now, Nick?" Let's talk about that just a second,
Yeah.
and the fallacy of I'm better now. Like, I have a disease that I will have for the rest of my life,
Mm-hmm.
and it's very rare, and it's not curable. But people always say that, like, "You feel good now, right? Huh? You're better now, right?" You want to just lovingly, in the name of Jesus, slap them, but you can't, because there's other people around and they'll see you do
Yeah.
it. So, but you want to. So it's insensitive. It's offensive.
Mm.
It's harmful. So you mentioned that earlier, and it made me think about, like, what other insensitive or harmful comments that are inadvertent. People don't know they're being ignorant, right?
Yeah.
But what other comments maybe have you received from congregants or clergy regarding mental health struggles that just were really hard to swallow, and how did you handle it?
Yeah, I mean, definitely like the "Are you better?" Uh, is a big one. And then again, I think it comes from a place of ignorance, not necessarily a place of maliciousness or anything like
Maybe
that.
naivety is a
Yeah,
better word.
naivety would be a good word.
Yeah, maybe.
Um, I mean, people. I think people just make comments that they don't really think about. And we do this not even just in mental health, but we do this like holistically across the board. Of like when people they just ask questions and they're like, "Oh yeah, I totally understand," and it's like, "Oh, so you struggle with mental health?" No, then you don't fully understand, right? And again, that's not born out of a bad thing. I think it's just because people don't know how to engage or what to say or how to respond, right? It's like, oh crap, like I've never been here before, so I'm just going to attempt to relate in um, whatever way I can, and we often try to do that by putting up this pretense of understanding when we don't. Um, and and I think maybe we do that under the pretense of empathy, but it's like you
Yeah.
can't fully empathize if you haven't fully been there.
No, you can't, right?
And that doesn't mean you can't walk with somebody, you can't be in their corner, you can't listen.
Right.
Like that's a different component of empathy, but like to be like, oh, I get it, I understand. No, you don't. Like same thing, like if somebody were to come to you and go, oh, Tim, you're taking this medication, I get it. I get what it feels like to not feel like you. Oh, so you're taking this medication too, right? You've had this experience. And they're like, no, I take Advil. And it's like, no, not the same thing, right? But
People, what I've learned in my life is that people mean well, but sometimes in their good intentions, they can be um, harmful. So I'm the one who has to respond to that with grace.
yeah, yeah. And that's,
You can't always respond to it with grace. And you want to, right? But
we do
once
our best.
again, I'm a pastor and a person and a human being, and so I've got my moments of weakness. One comment that was made to me a few months ago by a friend who was dealing with some serious issues that are um, equivalent to yours.
Hmm.
He said, I wish I had any other disease below the neck.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Any other disease below the neck. Because people would treat me better. They wouldn't be so cruel. They might try to understand. And I would feel like there's hope.
Mm. Yeah.
And this individual has been battling for 5 years and not really finding any relief. They have changed their cocktail of meds time and time and time again, unable to get them balanced.
Mm.
And so, you know, I know you know how that feels. Any other disease below the neck, because we are much more compassionate to like cancer,
Mm-hmm.
obesity, you know, any other physical element you might be dealing with. Not that obesity is necessarily a disease, it can be, but you know what I'm saying is that you can see it, and you wouldn't just write somebody off and flippantly say ignorant things to them.
Yeah.
When it's a more of a physical issue. So how would you suggest, or what would you encourage pastors and churches to potentially do today? I mean, I told you this morning we're going to release this episode early May during Mental Health Awareness Month. And then what would you encourage churches to consider to do practically in their teaching, their programming, their public discourse that can help people in their congregation? And then I want to get to the last question about what would you encourage a pastor to do for themselves?
Yeah. First, I think it needs to be part of the discourse within churches. I think within student ministry, I think it's easy to have these conversations, to teach on it, because students they're more vulnerable and transparent with what they're going through. I think for some reason, adults are more prone to hide or not be as transparent. And I think the more that churches can have these transparent conversations, we talk about everything else from the pulpit, right? Even stuff we probably shouldn't.
Maybe.
Yeah. But at the same time, it's like, man, like if we are seeing the studies that say that this reality, this illness is past epidemic proportions, we should be doing something about it for our people. Like I remember when studies came out after like Me Too and Church Too, and they talked about the number of women and men within our churches who had suffered, whether sexual harassment, assault, rape, you name it, right? And it's like churches didn't necessarily respond well to that either. They didn't necessarily talk about that. It's like, if we know that these people are in our pews, why, pardon my language, but why the hell aren't we talking about it, right? Like, if we know this is something there, we need to be doing something for our people. And one of the things, at least for me, I have the privilege of being on our preaching team at Hershey, and that's not something I take lightly. I know that a lot of people, especially in youth men, don't readily get asked to be a part of the preaching team for big church.
Yeah, you JV guys, man.
I know. It's like we have no idea what we're doing. I wear jeans when I preach, skinny jeans at that. But part of who I am as a pastor and an individual, I try to be personal in who I am in the applications and to be honest and authentic. And the last time I preached, I shared a little bit about my journey again. And I think the more authentic we are, the more we invest in those moments, the more our people are going to go, it's okay to have these struggles. It's okay to have them. But I think as a church, like, we also need to provide not just a safe space to say it's okay. We also need to be willing to provide support. And I realize that not every church is going to be in the position that the church I'm at is. I mean, we have the opportunity. We have counselors who work out of our church. We have connections with local agencies to help people get into, we have people on staff who will walk with, and not every church has that. Like, we have the financial capabilities to help in certain moments, but that's not the only thing that churches can do.
No.
Like, creating that safe
No.
place is huge, but then also saying, hey, we have people who will walk with you, who will sojourn with you, not try to fix you, not try to tell you what to do or where you're wrong or the missteps that you've taken, but instead to say, I'm in your corner.
Yeah.
I think
with.
Yes.
It's just with, right.
I like you, not like, I'm not, I will give you an indirect shout out here, Tim. Like, your book Alone Sucks, I think is clear in that, right? Like, when you journey alone, it sucks. When you journey with, it doesn't mean that everything's okay and everything's better, but you're able to work through it better. You're able to have people who support you.
My wife calls it sharing a cup of sorrow.
That is a great way to put it.
And when you share a cup of sorrow, it's easier because now it's only half a cup.
Yeah. Yep.
When you got to drink the whole cup of sorrow or struggle by yourself, it's hard to choke down. But when you can share it with somebody, it's much easier to swallow because only half a cup.
Yeah. And that's so true.
She's so much smarter than I am.
And
so,
my other thing I would encourage people to do is to get involved with networks of people who can support you.
Yeah.
One of the things that when I was getting ready to take my leave, one of my dear friends on staff, she came up to me and she goes, I have a book for you. And if it had been anybody else, I would have dismissed it, because I'm like, they're like giving people self-help books, right? That doesn't necessarily work. But she called me, she gave me a book by Sean Johnson, the pastor out at Red Rocks Church in Colorado, called Attacking Anxiety. And that was a book, took me a very long time to read because I got through the introduction and it broke me. Just his rawness and realness. And I would say that anybody who's struggling with anxiety, depression, panic attacks, self-harm, whatever, that's a great resource to read through. He also has his whole sermon series on it online, as he relates about his own personal struggle through it. But in that book, it talks about one of the things that you can do is what they call building an army. And realistically, what Sean's talking about is just having these people who are in your corner, who share that cup of sorrow, right? And for me, it was my cohort. There's 12 people in my cohort, and when I tell you that they are some of the best friends that I have, it's very true. Partners in ministry, friends, people who...
True comrades, right? True comrades.
Yeah, and people who've walked through this themselves. And even in that cohort over the last year, I've had multiple friends in that cohort go, Nick, I know you're walking through this, and I'm starting to walk through it, and it's terrifying. What can I do?
Yeah.
And so to have that army of people that you can go to, and I know for some people in churches, you might not feel safe doing that, and you're in that space. And partly that's why I have my cohort, is because none of them are at my church. Like, the closest is 4 hours away.
So let's close with that idea, because I want you to speak for 30 seconds to the pastor who immediately is saying in this conversation, there's nobody I can go to.
Oh, man.
They can't talk about their partner or their people. Think about the average church out there with one pastor, part-time, bivocational, a half-time assistant at most. That's the majority of churches in America.
Yep.
What word of encouragement would you leave them with in this conversation?
First, that you are not in this by yourself. It's real easy when you're wrestling with this stuff to truly feel like it's just you. And that's not true. There are so many people, pastors, who wrestle with this, and others who will walk with you through that. There are networks, there are communities out there who will partner with you. There's so many online counseling agencies now that will do Zoom calls that will meet you where you're at, in the space that you're at. Hell, if you want to talk, like, Tim can get you connected to me.
Well, I'll give him your number in the middle of the night.
Yeah, I know you will.
3 o'clock in the morning. Wake up. Yeah.
And I think just understand that there is a community out there of people who get it.
Yeah.
And I also want you to hear that just because you struggle with this, it doesn't make you any less.
Right.
It doesn't negate your gift.
There's nothing wrong with you, right?
No.
There's nothing wrong with you.
No, and it sure as hell doesn't negate your calling.
There you go.
I think the more honest and transparent you are with where you're at, the more honest the realization will be in your life that you need a savior working in it. And
there you go.
And it's oftentimes in the midst of our brokenness, in the midst of our pain and our own hurt, that we realize how great the grace of God is. And it's only through that, not of ourselves, that we get to do what we do. And I will tell you that for me, walking through this, one of the biggest things I came away with was like how desperately inadequate I am as a person, but how amazingly adequate my Savior is, who empowers me to do what I do. I'm not better, like, to answer the question that so many people have asked. And that's okay. What's not okay is staying in the brokenness and not trying to move through it. And so if that's where a pastor's at, just know you're not alone. Know there's people who are sojourning with you, who want to walk with, as Tim, as your amazing wife put it, to drink that cup of sorrow with. And there is hope. That was one thing that my counselor, he encouraged me to write down what I was thinking. I've looked back at my notes and I said, I want to have hope again. And it took a long time to get to that place. But as you do the hard, the messy work, the walking through the trenches, the more you come to realize that there is hope. It may not be perfect, but you'll get there.
We're not called to perfection. We're called to progress.
Amen to that.
And progress can be 1 step forward, 2 steps back, but it's still progress as long as we try to keep moving and we don't give up. I could not ask for a better conversation about this topic, brother. And because you can speak to it with so much more authority than I possibly can. We are going to, in the show notes, list everything that has been referenced. We'll make links to networks. The Authentic Pastor has created a sermon series on mental health, and that pastors, if they want to, can use, whether it be in a Bible study, a Sunday morning devotional. And if you don't want to use it and I'm not ready to quite deal with it, maybe start with yourself. But we will give you all the support that we possibly can, not pretending that we are the experts in mental health, but we will be the advocate for you, so you don't have to walk it alone. Because as Nick says, without like a personal plug, alone sucks. It just alone sucks, and you don't have to feel alone. Tell your beautiful bride that I said hello. I know that she's somewhere in your house, and I appreciate you.
Appreciate you too,
I know
Tim.
we planned this for a long time, so thank you so much for speaking your heart. Honestly,
thanks for having me on. I appreciate it tons. So.
You bet, Nick.
All right, man.